You began climbing in the late 70s, is that correct?
Mid 70s, around 74.
74. So you've seen it's just like a completely different world than it is today. Am I correct by saying that?
Oh man, the equipment is different. The mindset is, though. Yeah, it was when I started. I was using a gold line rope as my first rope, so
Mm.
things were a lot different.
Yeah, I can't imagine just like the not only technology but culture and access and the amount of actual people climbing has changed so much. And so, yeah, I really want to dive into that progression, what it was like for you to find climbing, and really give you a chance to kind of share your origin story with everybody. So, yeah, let's dive into it. How did you find the world of climbing, and who and what kind of shaped you along your path to where you are today?
I really owe it to my parents, in particular my mother. When she was young, her father took her to the Sierra, and he was a fisherman. So every summer they would go up and go on fishing and camping trips. And when I was a little kid, I have three brothers, my parents would do the same thing. So they introduced us to the Eastern Sierra at a very young age. And it was an annual thing, like 2 weeks every summer. And we went to Yosemite. We went to a lot of Eastern Sierra locations. But I think it was the first time driving through Tuolumne Meadows that I saw some climbers up on one of the rocks. And it just seemed so incredible to me and so fantastic. And, it's so pristine, the environment up there. I saw that and I immediately wanted to do it. And I was probably 12 or 13 years old. And then I remember my dad took me and my three brothers to the base of El Cap. And I just started climbing up a little ways. And I got up there and I remember him yelling at me, "Get down from there, you're going to break your leg." And I was already pretty keen on climbing at that time, and I had already read a bunch of books on climbing. And I think we got back in the station wagon, the whole family, and we're driving to Camp Curry. And I just blurted out, I'm going to climb El Capitan someday." And my dad said, "Son, it's too sheer. No one could ever climb that." But I already bought the guidebook, the old Roper Green guidebook. And I said, "Well, actually, Dad, the first ascent of the nose of El Capitan was in 1958 by Warren Harding, Wayne Mary, and George Whitmore." And he just kind of looked at me. Remember, he was glaring at me in the rearview mirror. He didn't say anything, but he was probably thinking, "Oh, here we go." And at first, my parents were sort of against it. But I was just so interested. It was unstoppable. And I would recruit, buddies from high school. And I think the first climbing experience I had was kind of sobering. I was too young to drive, but one of my high school buddies, his brother drove us to Stony Point, which is a bouldering area in LA. And we got out of the car and my friend started to climb up Boulder 1, which is that big boulder right in the front there for people that are familiar with Stony Point. He got up about 15 feet and fell off. On the way down, he hit a little ledge with his ankle and sacked his ankle out, and that was it. We had to go home.
Damn. Did he break it or
I think he broke his ankle.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I thought to myself, this shit is dangerous.
Mm.
So right then and there, I'm like, okay, this is serious stuff.
You learned that lesson early on.
That was my first experience.
Yeah.
And all the climbing I did in the beginning, I was leading everything. So I was on the sharp end, and it's difficult to progress if you're just leading and you're not top roping. This was before, obviously the gyms had become popular. So my progress was pretty slow in the beginning, but I was careful.
What about, so when you're driving through Tuolumne and you saw the people up there, had you already read about what climbing was when you saw them?
Yeah, when I was young, I would go in the school library and I would devour all the literature. I would read every single book on mountaineering, climbing. I was just fascinated by it.
So you were fascinated by it before you saw someone climbing outside in real life.
Yes, but when I saw those climbers, that just did it for me. I'm like, I'm going to do that. Yeah.
Had you ever, was there any time in your life before that moment that you had felt a passion like that for something else?
Um, I was athletic. I was involved in sports, so I did have a passion for athletics. You know, when I was in high school, I was a high school football star. I was a track athlete. You know, a long jumper. I think I had my high school record at one time for the long jump, and I ran the 110.7. So I was an athlete. Um, I was a fullback and middle linebacker and in football. So I came from a pretty athletic background. But I realized in the beginning that I needed to train really hard to be a world-class rock climber. So I knew that. And when I got to college, I trained really hard. My program was to do 100 pull-ups a day. So I'd do 4 sets of 25 every day for years. And I got into gymnastics. They had a gymnastics class program at Long Beach State where I went to college. So that gave me access to all the gym apparatus. And I trained until I could do a one-arm pull-up. And so I was pretty strong at that time. And I remember I was out bouldering, and I think my strength was a lot better than my technique. So I was on a boulder problem doing like a one-arm pull-up, and something happened to my shoulder. I'm like, oh, this isn't good. I went to the orthopedic guy, and he says, you have a broken clavicle.
Oh my God.
And I said, no, I didn't fall. I can't have a broken clavicle. He said, well, this is called an avulsion fracture, and this is what gymnasts get sometimes. So I was working out a little too hard, so I backed off a little bit after that. But I saw guys like Don Bachar and John Long, and I saw the way they trained, and that inspired me to train really hard. So I got really strong at the beginning, right at the outset, especially when I was in college.
Were you running into people like that early on, or was it more like you heard stories of John Bachar and what they were doing, and it was kind of like through the grapevine, or did you come in contact with these people early on?
Well, Bachar I saw at Joshua Tree. So when I started to go out to Joshua Tree, in the morning, you would see Bachar soloing around on all these 511 climbs, all by himself. There was no entourage. This was before the internet. This was before people were publicizing their climbing. And he would just go out alone. And in the morning, he would do 10 or 11, a dozen 511 climbs right off the bat. So we would see it. And we would see how he trained, too. When I started going to Yosemite, I would see his training stuff set up in Camp 4, the Bachar ladder, like a crude wooden hangboard. So I kind of knew what I needed to do, and I started training a lot, especially when I was in college.
So what was your progression like as a climber? You said it was slow in the first year, and honestly, I kind of resonate with your progress as kind of like dragging people up, almost like acting as a mentor when you should be mentored in a way.
I didn't have a mentor at first, but
Yeah,
I think around 1979, I met John Long up at Suicide Rock. I was just up there, and he was with Lynn Hill that day. She was up on a climb with someone else. And he said, hey, you want to do a pitch? And I'm like, sure. And we roped up and did a climb, and I got to know him a little bit. So after that, from 1980 to 1985, we were pretty regular climbing partners. We climbed a lot. We did a bunch of first free ascents, particularly in Idlewild, Talkeets and Suicide Rocks, that were pretty standard setting at the time. Back then in 1980, if you were climbing 512 plus, that was like a world-class grade.
yeah.
And so it took me, I started climbing probably 1974. I started climbing at the 512 level in around 1980. And I climbed in both sport and trad at the 512 level from 1980 until about 2005. So about 25 years. So I've had a pretty solid background in, both trad climbing and sport climbing.
Absolutely. You almost like, I just ran into John Bachar and Lynn Hill. You almost say it like kind of nonchalantly. Do you feel like that was serendipitous and rare and like, a lucky moment for you? Or, was that kind of just being one of the few people inspired by those areas at that time, you're going to run into these people because there's so few people? Like what kind of was it?
Like you said, there weren't that many climbers at the time. So, for example, at Joshua Tree, back then it was called the Monument, all the climbers would kind of stay in Hidden Valley Campground in the same sites. So they kind of banded together, and, it was serendipitous in a way to meet John Long and start climbing with him. So I look back at my career in climbing, and I had a lot of serendipitous moments that were, in a way, lucky, but at the same time, I was prepared and ready to go. Like, once I met John, we were off to the races.
Yeah.
And one day he said, I think he came over to my house to meet my parents, and he said to my mom, your son's a world-class climber. And I thought to myself, huh? And then I started to believe it. And one thing about climbing with John, he was a lot better than I was, but I would watch him climb something, and then I would just say to myself, well, that's the way you do it. That's how it's done. And then I would do it. So a lot of it, like you said, the mentoring is actually being with someone who could do it, and you could emulate that.
Yeah. And also there just to show you that it's even possible, right?
That it's possible.
Yeah.
You'd say, well, that's how you do it. That's the move. It's possible.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Did you see a benefit? So the first year that you had no mentor, you were bringing people up, you were recruiting friends. When you look back on that time in your life as a climber, could you extrapolate any benefit from introducing yourself to the sport that way?
Well, yes, I think it teaches you a lot about judgment. Because back then a lot of the climbing was very run out, very trad. So, you know when you're in a scary situation. And if you don't want to get hurt, you got to be very careful when you're pushing your limits. So I was cautious, but I didn't have any moments where I felt like I was in jeopardy. But I built a foundation. And I think a lot of climbers nowadays, they climb really hard in the gym, they boulder really hard in the gym, they go outside, and they want to climb at high levels. But if they get into trad climbing, they haven't really built that foundation. Back in the old days, if we wanted to get good at crack climbing, we would spend a couple years in Yosemite, like a couple summers in Yosemite, living in our van, climbing cracks. And that's one thing I've seen in my guides training is, back in the old days, a lot of the climbers that got into guiding, they had this foundation that they built with, years of climbing in Yosemite and doing big walls and a lot of trad climbing. And nowadays, you get these apprentice guides, they want to get certified, but they haven't laid down that foundation, and they're just kind of missing a step.
Yeah, I think the level and depth of that foundation is probably misunderstood as well on just how much data you need.
Yeah, you learn by your mistakes.
The one thing about climbing, though, is some of the mistakes you don't survive, or you get completely maimed from. And I think it's honestly reflecting on your story, just the fact that you had that accident happen in front of you, like right in the beginning of your climbing experience, to me is once again almost like this serendipitous thing, because I do feel like that's something that plagues our community a lot, is that people just don't really understand how real the danger is until it happens to someone right next to you or to yourself. It's like really hard to really get that ingrained in your mind and kind of take the risks seriously sometimes. So it's cool that you had that lesson up front and you carried it with you, because I don't want to jump too far, but you've been climbing for 45 years now and you're uninjured up to this point. Is that correct?
That's true. I can't remember any accident that I've had climbing where I couldn't walk away from it. So I guess I could say I haven't had any serious accidents.
How much of that would you say was luck versus like risk mitigation?
Well, I think like I said, it involves judgment and risk mitigation. And I've pretty much my whole career been involved in risk mitigation. In my work as a guide, as a manager of a climbing school, in my work as a stunt coordinator. I've worked as a safety officer on movies. So that's something that I've been focused on, I think, most of my adult life.
Mm. And you what did you see? You had this philosophy where, what is it?
I think with guiding, my philosophy is, and always was in 40 years of running a climbing school, if I gave a client an opportunity to make a mistake, they will make that mistake.
Mm.
And that was sort of my guiding philosophy all those years, both as a guide and running a climbing school. And so I was really tight on supervision and knowing when to really watch someone from a risk mitigation standpoint.
Now, I think that's, watching someone else and kind of being that third person is one thing, but then there's also that self-regulation, right? And the battle of the ego trying to get the send, maybe chasing the onsite and putting yourself into these kind of situations where you might be in over your head and you're kind of just like kind of going for the chains essentially. But I had written something down here, and correct me if these are wrong, but you said you value positivity over tenacity and judgment over ability. You want to kind of unpack those two things?
Yeah, I think in one of the books that I co-authored with John Long, he calls it the protection problem. And it's really more specific to trad climbing, where you have to be able to assess your protection and how solid it is and your ability to make the run out. So that's really the crux, and that's really what it boils down to if you want to be a safe trad climber. In sport climbing, accidents occur more from lapses of concentration and distraction and ignorance rather than the protection problem, which is what you get into with the trad climbing. So you have to have that ability to assess your protection placements and also that ability to make good judgments on what you could safely climb and when to back off. And I think a lot of newer climbers, particularly male climbers, they tend to just keep trying until they fall off rather than back down, because if they back off a climb, it's not considered a success. But you have to look at it from a different standpoint. And say you backed off a climb and rappelled down safely. Well, that's a victory and that's a success too, because you didn't get hurt.
And you've never struggled with that inner voice of putting yourself in harm's way for your own egotistical benefit?
I've had a couple situations when I used to do more free soloing. Like back in the 90s, I was free soloing like at the 510 level, and I had a few situations where I thought to myself, man, that was just a little sketchy, and I can remember one climb in particular where I hadn't done enough stretching in the morning, and it was a super duper high step with my left foot. I just couldn't get my foot on the hold, and I was about 40 feet off the ground, and I just thought, holy shit, if I fall. And that was a little wake-up call. So I think I wrote in one of my books that free soloing has the ultimate irony, which is you can die as a direct result of not wanting to die. So it's like, it's all fun in the sun, and you're flowing up the rock, and there's that feeling of the air beneath your feet, and it's the greatest feeling in the world. And then suddenly there's like a dark cloud that blots out the sun, and that fear could overcome you so instantly.
And that's what ends up killing you, right? Because you lose the concentration and you lose your connection to the rock.
You get scared.
Yeah. Do you have a moment in your career where you remember being the most scared, the most fearful?
The thing is, when you're doing the really scary stuff, and I think it's a trait that I have because I've been involved in rescue situations and some pretty dicey situations where I just become calmer and I sort of slow down as opposed to getting excited. And I've noticed that about myself. And I just focus on what I need to do. As far as climbing goes, I think one of the scariest climbs that I ever did was a new route on Talkeet's Rock called the Happy Hooker, which is actually an aid climb. And I'm kind of proud of it. But at the same time, I'm kind of shocked that I even did it because it's so scary. And it involves a long section of hooking. So it's an aid climb where you're hanging on hooks.
Mm-hmm.
And it's on the head wall to the left of the Vampire. So it's on the steepest part of Talkeet's Rock. And I did it in 1994, and I don't believe it's had a second ascent. Some people have gone up there and taken some big falls, but
Wow.
it was, I think I was doing a lot of ground up climbing where I was hanging on hooks to drill bolts on free climbs. And so I got really good at hooking. So when I went up on this climb, I used 2 or 3 hooks and balanced on them at the same time, all the way up this pitch. And, some of the runouts were, maybe 25 or 30 feet. So if you fall, you're going to go a long ways. And psychologically, I think that was what I would consider the scariest climb I've done in terms of someone wanting to repeat it. It's going to be really scary. But at the time, I just kind of blocked all that out and just focused on doing it and not falling.
Wow. Very cool.
And I thought, what if I fall, it's a clean fall. And I just put in the bolt. I know it's a good bolt. So I might go 100 feet, but, it's a clean fall. And part of it, too, is the judgment part, is knowing when you can safely fall.
Mm-hmm. It's a big one for sure. I've been hearing a lot.
So is the protection good? And is the fall going to be clean? And then go for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I don't want to go too much into this because we just did an episode with Silas and we dove really, really deep into risk. But he said that, I asked the question, how do we trust our own judgment more? Because it's fine and dandy to be like, yeah, that piece will hold me. But sometimes we make mistakes in judgment. And so how do we increase our odds of that judgment being correct? And he was just like, you need the data. You need time with the equipment. You need testing of the equipment, whether it's aid climbing or actually falling on the gear in different scenarios, and building that data set so you actually have tangible information to work with rather than it being subjective.
Yeah, I always say there's no substitute for experience. And when I was teaching guides courses, the first thing I would do is get the group together and I'd say, okay, everybody put your rack on the picnic table. And I would just look at their equipment. And you'd see racks where the cams are all worn down and everything's kind of scratched up. And you'd see other stuff with price tags on it. So right then and there, you'd know who the climbers were. And I'd often go with the guy with the worn cam, I'd say, have you done the Roosevelt cap? And he'd say, yep.
Yeah. Yeah, your gear shows for sure. Yeah. I just redid all my slings after 10 years, like the soft goods rule, and I look like a Gumby now.
Well, it's nice to have new gear, though.
It is.
On the other hand, you have these guys with all old gear that needs to be replaced. So there's a balance there.
It's terrifying. Some people
I like new gear.
I've been climbing with this, soft good for 30 years. I'm just like, ew, that's kind of terrifying.
Yeah.
Let's circle back to kind of your mentorship. Such icons like John Long and John Bachar. How did you see yourself amidst these icons, and how was their impact on you? How, maybe some key formative stories of interacting with these people, and how did it kind of shape you as a climber specifically?
With Bachar, I think it was just watching the precision of his technique, and I always tried to emulate that. So people say, "Oh, Bob, you have really smooth footwork. How do you get smooth footwork?" And a lot of it's mental. I just focus on it, and part of it is just every move you make, you just focus on being precise with that move with your foot. So it's really more of a mental challenge and a focus from the first move. I've climbed a lot with Peter Croft, and he always said he likes to do an easy warm-up climb. He said it's like target practice. So on that easy climb, he really emphasizes his footwork and almost goes in slow motion and gets super precise. And that just puts him in that mindset for the whole day to have that precision with his footwork. Mm. That's one thing I learned from him. Mm. And I've learned a lot about crack climbing from Peter Croft too, because he just is able to show you really good technique, but also explain what he's doing.
Yeah, I resonate a lot with the footwork and moving fluid and smooth like that. It lends to a better climbing experience, in my opinion, as well.
Yeah, I look at every climb you have the opportunity to have that precision and technique. It's like a dance. And I think a lot of it is just mental focus from the outset that a lot of people never have, but they just need someone to teach them, this is what you want to focus on. like from the first move of the day.
When did you start doing SAR work in Yosemite?
When I was in college, I spent the summers in Yosemite. So that was early 80s. And I spent 4 summers in Yosemite. So it's kind of a funny story, but the way that I got on Yosar was I was actually doing an El Capitan route called the Shield. And we were just starting out the first day. So we were doing the first part of the Salate Wall, which is called the Free Blast. And as the afternoon wore on, it's about 12 pitches up to Mammoth Terrace where we were going to bivouac. And it's sort of windy. And as the afternoon wore on, I started to hear kind of muffled voices. And then it got more distinct. And finally I could hear, help, help, help. And I looked at my partner. I'm like, okay, here we go. So when we got up there, what we saw were 2 guys that had been up there, it turned out, for 2 nights. And they had put all their ropes in one big haul bag. And they were going to fix ropes down from there and then come back up. And the strap on their haul bag broke and they lost all their stuff.
Oh my gosh.
And the one guy, he had a t-shirt on and he had pulled it down to his ankles. It looked like a sleeping bag. It was all stretched out. And I remember, we kind of our eyes met, and he just looked at me. He goes, oh man, you don't smoke, do you? He knew. He was jonesing for a cigarette. And it turned out they were going to climb El Cap and then base jump off. One of the guys, the base jumper, was a very inexperienced climber.
Mm.
So down at the meadow, Yosar is starting to gather on the road down there. We could see him. And then they get the bullhorn out and they started to yell up to us, climbers on Mammoth Terrace, if you can hear us, raise your right arm. And it started like that, and a bunch of pantomimes. And it ended up with me and my partner agreeing that we would rappel down with these 2 guys in the morning. So we spent the night with them, and they were so happy because they were hungry and they were cold. And then we rappelled down with them the next day. And I remember the one guy, he goes, you can have all my climbing gear. I quit. But they were happy. And then John Dill, who was the head of Yosar, he goes, hey, let's go have dinner. I want to do a little debrief with you. And so we talked a bunch. And then he asked me, hey, do you want to join Yosar? And I said, sure. And back then it was a real perk because you could stay in Camp 4.
Mm.
And, when you were on call, if you stayed there, you could go on rescues and get paid. And then if you wanted to sign out and go climbing, you could do that. I was mostly signed out and going climbing, but I did participate in quite a few rescues too.
Wow. Real quick, I want a tangent, I guess. Work-wise, at this point in your life, did you have a career path you were following? How were you earning money? Were you just vagabonding? What was that like?
I budgeted myself in those years $20 a day, and I lived like a king in Yosemite. I had no bills, no mortgage, no insurance.
How had you earned that cash up to that point?
I had saved it up. I was a painter, like a house painter in college. That was kind of my side gig. So I painted apartments and residential buildings, and made some money doing that.
Nice. Okay, so you're $20 a day. You're in Yosemite. You've joined Yosar now. Do you have any standout stories that stuck with you, that either good or bad?
I do remember the first rescue I ever went on, and it was at dusk. And the report was that a base jumper had jumped off El Cap and gotten into trouble. And he was at the base of El Cap, somewhere to the right of the nose. So I was with Werner Braun, who's like the godfather of Yosemite climbing. So the 2 of us ran up there, and in short order, we found the guy. And he was roughly at the base of the North American Wall, which is one of the sheerest parts of the base of El Cap on the right side there. And what was weird about it was there was no base rig. He had like climbing clothes on, and he had like climbing boots on. And his story was, oh man, that'll teach me to free solo. Oh man. And I look up and I'm like, dude, this is like A4. It was like, there's no way. And turned out he was a Navy pilot, and it's a federal offense.
Oh.
And he would have gotten in big trouble. So, but he was busted up really bad. He had a broken pelvis, broken leg, broken arm, head injury. So he had to bite the bullet. We couldn't give him any pain medication. But remember carrying him down, he was just screaming the whole time because, that's pretty rough terrain. And we carried him down in a litter back to the road, and met the guy later. We became good friends years later. I actually worked on a commercial with him where he did a base jump off a radio antenna tower in Florida for a
Wow.
Mountain Dew commercial. And even that was like 20 years later, he still walked with a little hitch to his giddy up.
Yeah.
He still had a little limp,
Yeah. Wild. So he base jumped, and his parachute, like he crashed back into the wall? Like, do you know the circumstances of his accident?
He had a bad opening because when you open your chute, ideally it should be pointed straight out from the wall.
Yep.
And then you kind of sail outward. If you have a bad opening, like if it's 180 degrees to the right, then you're going straight into the cliff. So if you have a bad opening when you're base jumping, it can be really bad because it can turn you right into the cliff if you don't have enough room to maneuver. And that's what happened to him. So he hit the cliff and he sort of bounced all the way down.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Lucky to be alive.
Yeah.
Wild. Has base jumping always been illegal in Yosemite?
There was a time, a short period of time where it was legal. And then it was shortly curtailed after that. It was just getting too crazy. People jumping off El Cap.
Do you feel like it should be legal, or do you feel like there's more benefits to keeping the public from doing that?
It's pretty wild to see it. I couldn't do it personally. I've like I said, I worked on that commercial in Florida where I was imagining jumping off this 1,200 foot tower, and the mindset it would require to just leap off.
Yeah.
And I convinced myself that I could not do it. Should it be legal? I think if there was a permit system, maybe, and where it was a little more controlled, because it's such, if you're a climber, it's a beautiful place. And I'm sure if you're a base jumper, it's one of the most beautiful places. But I think they'd have to control it a little bit.
Yeah.
It
is interesting. I think, we can talk about this a little bit when we get to the bolting topic, but the idea of like non-climbers making rules for climbers and non-base jumpers making rules for base jumpers, I find a bit of a hypocrisy there. It's an interesting thing, a dance that we have to play.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Because what better cliff is there to jump off than El Cap?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, there's got to be some sort of regulation there. But you would hope that someone who understands the sport, understands the nuances of everything, is the one that's like kind of setting the stage and doing it the right way, rather than someone who doesn't understand it making rules that don't make any sense. Okay, so this next little chapter, you have established between, is it 600 to 700 first ascents at this point?
Yeah, somewhere in that range, I think. Joshua Tree, probably about 500.
Wow. So most of them are isolated in Joshua Tree?
Mostly Joshua Tree. That's my main area. And I probably have about 100 up at Idlewild at Talkeets and Suicide Rocks.
And I asked this question to everybody who kind of goes down this road, but I think there's a junction, right? There's like, I guess it's different now because access is so staggering. We could just go climb classics every day for the rest of our lives and never have to put any up new routes. I'm assuming back in the 80s, it was different where there was just so much untouched rock where it was kind of just, that's what you do almost. But what about the creative vision and the process of establishing new routes like called to you? What about your personality connected with it?
Um, it just was something that whenever I went out, I would look at what had not been climbed. I think most people, when they go out with their guidebook, they just look for the routes they want to do or what's in the guidebook. And early on, um, I had some friends who developed a new bouldering area near LA called the Purple Stones. And that was so much fun, just discovering new boulders and putting up new boulders. So I just got a hankering for it. And then when I went out to Joshua Tree, you could just see there was a lot of great climbs to be done.
Do you see it as like an art form in a way, or is it just a way to climb more in a way?
I'd say as an art form, particularly if you're putting up face climbs, because then you have to decide where the bolts go. And for me, I think the most fun aspect of it was picking a challenging route. And there was always that doubt and that moment of truth when you realized, oh, this is going to go. And sometimes it boils down to one or two holds being there. And if they weren't there, it wouldn't go. And that moment of realization, like if I'm working it on the top rope or if I'm leading, and all of a sudden it dawns on me like, okay, this is going to go. This is going to be a new route. That was the most fun aspect for me, for sure. So it's that act of discovery. And on bigger climbs, like in Yosemite, it's a whole process. Like a lot of times I'd be down in the meadow with a telescope looking at the features from down in the valley and wondering what it's going to be like when you get up there. And so that was an act of discovery too, doing ground up first ascents on these huge walls in Yosemite.
Do you have any first ascents on El Cap?
Not on El Cap. Probably my best one in Yosemite is a route I did with Scott Cosgrove in 1995 on the west face of Sentinel Rock. It's called How the West Was Won, and it was the first climb to free climb the west face of the Sentinel. It's a new 16 pitch route. And there was that one pitch where Scott had led it, and I knew it was the crux. We'd been working on it, and it was a 512 face climbing pitch. And I knew that that was the key to free climb that entire, 1,600 foot tall wall was this one move that I had to do. So I took off all the gear off my harness. I didn't even have a single carabiner. I put it all in the haul bag. So all I had was my shoes and my chalk bag on. And I told myself, okay, this is it. Because you can't do it, that you're not going to free climb this wall. And it all came down to one or two moves, and I pulled it off. It was like, that was a very satisfying climb.
Wow. Very cool. Let's talk about some other first ascents you've done. I would say that you are known to have an eye. Have you heard that before?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What would you attribute that eye to? Like describe what you think people are talking about. I'm sure you're as tired as I am of hearing ads about AG1, Fizzy Vantage, and all the other brands that you end up just skipping while listening to your favorite climbing podcasts. My vision is to create an ad-free show that is completely supported by its listeners. And for that dream to become a reality, I need your help. Become a supporting member of the Climbing Majority Podcast today. You'll receive access to exclusive episodes, you'll be able to ask upcoming guests your own questions, and ultimately, you'll be providing the critical support this show needs to stay ad-free. For as little as $3 a month, you can help support the show. Head on over to patreon.com/the Climbing Majority Podcast. That's patreon.com/the Climbing Majority Podcast.
Well, a lot of times when I've done new routes, people were like, wow, I can't believe that hadn't been done, because they were walking right by it. But for me, a lot of people, they'll go on Instagram or TikTok for fun. For me, for fun, I study rock formations and I look for lines between the routes, and I just study it. I take photographs. I look. And when I go out there, what I'm looking for is what hasn't been done, as opposed to, I think most people are just looking for what's been done and what they want to climb, established routes. So my mentality was always, okay, what hasn't been done? And the key is finding that gem and finding a really high quality new route. And to be a classic, there are a lot of traits that you need. Like, number one, it has to have a cool hangout at the base. It can't be just tons of a jumble pile of boulders, a bunch of bushes. Has to be a nice spot to hang out. Another quality is good rock quality. Another quality would be aesthetic climbing, like fun moves, not awkward. And in recent years, as I've gotten older, I tend to put in more bolts, so safer climbs too. And people generally like the safer climbs. Like back in the 80s, I was doing new routes that were R rated or X rated, which means, an X rated climb means basically if you fall, you're going to die. And, they're like, people call them museum climbs. Like people walk by and look at it, but they never climb it. But in recent years, I want climbs that are going to be fun for me to repeat. So I've tended to put up moderate sport climbs. And a lot of them I've done over and over again just because they're so much fun. And I want stuff that I could enjoy too, because some of the stuff that I did in the 80s and 90s, it was, a lot bolder, a lot more run out. And I'm more risk averse these days. And I'm not going to go back and retrobolt those climbs, but it's a different thing.
Yeah. So what do you think about that in terms of these routes that are kind of becoming, what did you call them?
Museum
climbs. Do you find that they, the story that they tell just by their existence is worth kind of them just sitting there as like a drive-by? Or do you feel like there is this opportunity for people to go and make them something new?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, the new generation might say, oh man, you guys screwed it up. All those classics in Yosemite, you just made them so scary. You screwed it up for all of us. But that's a big question. And so far, it really hasn't happened where, we thought it was going to happen where a new generation of climbers was going to come out of the gyms and want to retrobolt everything. It really hasn't happened. It could be the next generation that does it, but I hope not. There's still some psychological challenges out there. And, I think that's a great question and it hasn't really been answered. I think it's up to maybe the next generation and we'll see how they handle it.
I would imagine that the first ascensionist should be respected at the very least until they pass, right? Once they are gone and there's no one to say, hey, no, I want it this way still. Now who's the curator of these climbs? Who's the one that's managing them in a way? Like how many generations have to pass before someone takes the stand and like alters the route in a way? Or it gets to the point where the hardware that is used to protect the climb is so old that you can't even climb it anymore. Because
I think everyone agrees we should be able to replace aging hardware.
Yeah.
It's adding bolts to a route that is the big Pandora's box. And I think it depends on the grade of the climb. For example, Bachar soloed all these 5/8 climbs in Tuolumne that are just the most beautiful climbs. And is that going to lock that climb into being a death route for future generations? Or should, climbers get together and decide they want to bolt that and make it a fun, moderate climb? In Yosemite and in Tuolumne, a lot of routes, the climbing community has decided, let's retrobolt this 5/7 and make it fun for everyone. So there's a balance. And, if you look at the Bachar route, that's different. You're going to retrobolt that one? I would suggest not.
Yeah, you might have some people with pitchforks on your front door.
Yeah, but when all of us die, the next there's you're not going to have people around that are going to be like, oh, we're going to go chop those bolts, So they're going to have to deal with that. The rule right now, as far as I know, like in traditional areas like Joshua Tree in Yosemite, if there's a route that the climbing community thinks should have a bolt added, that if you ask a member of the first ascent party, is it okay? And they agree, then it's fine. And people have done that to me and I've said yes. So, but like you said, when those first ascent team members die off, then what's going to happen?
Yeah.
But it's up to the climbing community. So far it hasn't gotten out of control, but some areas like Suicide Rock where you have a lot of run out slab climbs, they're like ghost towns because nobody wants to go up there and get scared.
Yeah, exactly. What, in general, to kind of close off this specific topic, for your legacy and your route's legacy and some of the ones that you've put up that were R or X, after you've passed and you leave these climbs for all of us to continue to enjoy, how would you like to see these climbs left untouched? How would you like your routes respected as the time goes on?
Well, there's a lot of routes. I think in general, like I said, it kind of depends on the grade.
Mm.
And, most people, the general population climbs up to 510A, maybe B and below. There are not as many people climbing 512s. So there was an example of that at Joshua Tree where, back in the 80s, I was actually with a client I was guiding and she wanted to do a new route. So I led a new route on Echo Rock. It was this 130-foot slab that's 5.8, and I didn't put any bolts in. And, it's an X-rated climb, and we got to the top. I said, what do you want to name it? And her name was Penny, and she said, I want to call it Penny Lane. And I'm like, there you go. That's the name. So I went back. I think on Mountain Project, it was listed, and in like 20 years, it had like 2 or 3 ticks like on a top rope.
Mm.
And then I retrobolted it and made it a spore climb. And now it's had hundreds of ticks.
Yeah.
In just a couple years. And people really love it. They enjoy it. So I think there's a balance, and it's sort of like opening Pandora's box where do you draw the line? Because almost everyone would go like, yeah, I'd like another bolt on this climb. So I think the first ascent should be respected. But in some cases, especially if it's a moderate climb, where someone just soloed it who was climbing at a much higher level because it felt comfortable for them, like, Bachar soloing a 5.9 in Yosemite. They're sort of they're locking in that real estate forever, and it can't be bolted. I disagree with that. Maybe, like I said, the climbing community should get together and have a consensus. And there's been some debate on routes like Snake Dyke on Half Dome, because people have gotten hurt on that. Like, it's pretty run out.
I would say the bolts are not really even, there's not much point to them other than the anchors.
Yeah, but it's an easy climb. And, again, it involves judgment. And I've done that climb in so many different ways. I had my wife lead me up at one time. I took my little brother on it for his first rock climb ever, and he didn't belay me. And I just told him, hey, when I get to the top and I say you're on belay, just unclip this and start climbing. So there's different ways to do it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's undeniable to, how do I say this? It's undeniable that risk is a large part of why we enjoy climbing. I think that I heard a quote recently that said it's really fun to do dangerous things well. And I really like that quote, and it kind of encapsulates, I think, why, at least in the trad climbing world, and maybe, even other sports in area where, risk isn't as pervasive, but it's still definitely a key element, I think, to enhancing focus and like overcoming fear and existing in this dangerous space and being able to perform. So yeah, I think that there, to strip routes of that kind of character, it all, in like an entirety way, where you just take like overbolt a route that just doesn't need it, or you have a route like the Bachar you're in and you strip that down. It's like there's meaning there, and there's some test piece there about, and the risk plays a role. So I definitely don't think we need to like strip that from climbing.
No, I agree. And I think one thing about rock climbing that I tell people is, when people say, oh, it's so dangerous, the risk is there if you want to take it, but it can also be a very safe sport. You could just top rope, or you could free solo. So there's varying degrees of risk, and it's really up to you to have good judgment and know which level of risk that you want to take on. Because I've gone through the whole spectrum. When I was younger, I look back at some of the stuff I've done and I'm like, holy shit, I can't believe I did that. And now, I enjoy top roping more than anything. So I can just be relaxed and enjoy the moves and not have to risk a fall. So it's really up to the individual, how much risk do you want to take on? And part of it is learning how to use the equipment and be safe with the equipment, and then decide which level of risk you want. Do you want to just sport climb? Are you going to get into trad climbing? Are you going to get into alpine climbing? Are you going to get into soloing?
Yeah, we each get to choose the path. Back onto your first ascents. Before I dive into a couple of these specific ones, which I'd like to hear the story about. You were talking about the characteristics that make a classic. Have you developed a process to where you find these classics faster, or is it a numbers game?
Well, part of it is just looking for the quality stuff, and nowadays I'm more averse to spending time cleaning something. Like, I'm looking for really high quality rock if I'm going to spend the time and the effort to do a new route. So part of it is just looking for quality to begin with.
The rock quality specifically?
Rock quality.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about physical graffiti. That's a climb that I did recently with my buddy Bryce.
Oh, yeah?
I was really, really psyched on it. Beautiful climb, such a cool vision. I loved how much it wandered up the rock. We did it all in one pitch, which was
Nice.
really cool. Really cool footwork underneath the dike. Just like, just have to be really precise, kind of like up, down. Sometimes you're like high up on the dike. Sometimes you're a little bit low. And then you get the cool layback section and you get the pull roof. So it's like lots of really cool character. So yeah, talk to me about the vision for that and kind of, what that route means to you.
Well, I've climbed a lot in that valley, and the Anasazi Wall is where physical graffiti is, and that's at the end of that canyon. And I'd always look over there, and then a lot of times I go, looks like there might be something there. I saw a dike. So I just started walking over there, and I think I probably walked over there 10 times and just soloed up a little bit on the dike and then came back down. And then finally I just went to the top and anchored a rope and just went rope solo. And that one, at first, the rock quality actually wasn't that good.
It's pretty sandy at the bottom.
It was grainy, and I was pulling chunks off of the dike and flying out there. But finally, I kind of cleaned it up, and then I recruited a partner, and then we did it ground up. And turned out it's pretty good. I mean, it's not the best rock quality, but I think it's unusual because it has such variety in one pitch. Like you said, and it's got some cool dike features, and it has those characters that we talked about. Like, it has a cool hangout at the base. It's a nice spot. It's a nice wall. It's kind of on its own face there. And so all those things sort of came together on that one.
Yeah. Really well done on that one. That was was kind of like one of the main precipices for reaching out to you. My buddy Bryce has been kind of following you and your routes because he's based out of San Diego, and so he does a lot of climbing in Idlewild, and he spent a lot of time at Joshua Tree, and he's just like, oh, we're going to get on this Bob Gaines route, we're going to do, oh, I can't wait to get this other Bob Gaines route. And so he's kind of, become, a follower of all your routes. And after climbing that particular route, I was like, you know what? I want to shoot for the stars here and see if I can get in contact with this man, because that route was awesome.
Nice job doing that one.
It was really good.
That upper part's kind of hard. That move into the little cave below the roof.
I was like, I wanted the cave to have better holds, but it didn't. You just got past that little bit of a pumpy lie back. I'm just like, ooh, this is a little spicy now. But the roof pole was on big jugs, and I loved that. Yeah, it was really cool. Okay, let's talk about North Astrodome. Same kind of questions here. I just want to kind of dive into some of these first ascents.
The North Astrodome, I did a first ascent with Scott Cosgrove called the Gunslinger, and that was a memorable climb because I think it ended up being the longest route as far as multi-pitch climbing in Joshua Tree, and every pitch is really hard. I did it with Scott Cosgrove, and so it demands a lot of different skills, and we did that one ground up, and that was back when bolting was legal. That was before they even knew power drills were being used. So we bolted it ground up. And I remember on the last pitch, Scott was messing around with the hammer. He was trying to drill a bolt or something. and I was at a hanging belay, and he was about maybe 30 feet above me, and he dropped the hammer. So it goes sailing through the air, and I reach out and I grab it
No
and
way, you
catch it
caught it?
and caught it, and they saved the day because otherwise we had to go down. And I
Wow.
remember, that was just a couple weeks before I got married too. So it was a pretty meaningful route. And Scott was one of my main climbing partners in the 90s, and he worked as a guide with my Vertical Adventures climbing school for over 15 years. And so he was a really good partner and really good friend of mine.
Very cool. What grade was it? Is it?
Let's see. First pitch is 12C. It's a kind of a slab pitch. Second pitch is 11C. Third pitch is 12C, and the fourth pitch is 12A.
Wow.
Stemming.
Very, very stout. And you said it's mostly slabby, like Joshua
First
trees.
pitch is a slab, and we call it the mogul's pitch because it has like these humps of granite, like a ski mogul course. And the second pitch is kind of steep edging, like on a gray slab, similar to Run for Your Life type rock. And the third pitch is slightly overhanging on in-cut edges, so steep face climbing. And the fourth pitch is a stemming dihedral, and it had rock that's the similar texture of coral, like from a coral reef. So we called it the Coral Corner.
Whoa. And this is all in Joshua Tree?
4-pitch climb in Joshua Tree. It's one of the longest routes in Joshua Tree.
Wow. I got to add it to the list. That sounds amazing. The Run for Your Life, that wasn't a route you did, was it? Was it a Bob?
No, that's a Charles Cole route.
Okay. That one was fantastic. The rock, I've never, that is some seriously great granite.
Yeah, that's a beautiful rock. And I did a route right next to it called the Runaway, which is actually a sport climb. So it's similar to Run for Your Life, although it's a grade harder, and it's really well bolted. It's got like 11 bolts. So it's, Run for Your Life's a little run out, and then my route right next to it, the Runaway, is
it's on the left side of
just
that?
left of it, about
Just
15
left of it.
feet.
Okay. Yeah, I was climbing directly adjacent to those bolts. That's cool. Okay, I got two more. Saddle Rock and Silver Spur. These are two separate ones, correct?
Yes. Silver Spur, to me, that was like the ultimate slab first ascent, and slab climbing is kind of my specialty. So I found this slab up there. It's 3 pitches up Saddle Rock, and it's that perfect gray rock that you were just talking about, similar to that rock on Run for Your Life. No graininess, no loose holds. And it's one of the most sustained slab pitches in Joshua Tree. The first 7 bolts, I think it has 12 bolts on the pitch, but at the first 7 bolts, there's a 511 plus move at each of the first 7 bolts.
At each bolt? Wow.
At each bolt. So it's very sustained. And it took me about 5 years to do it. I kept going up there. Part of it is just where it is. You got to do a couple pitches of climbing just to get to it. And then it's so airy that it's hard not to get jittery when you're leading, because you're on these really thin edges, and you just have to stay so calm not to shake off. So the way I finally ended up doing it was I used sport climbing tactics. So I would just hang dog my way up the pitch, set up a top rope it, put tick marks on all the little edges, pull the rope, and then red pointed it. So that's one of my harder slabs. It's maybe 12C or 12D.
Wow. How would you describe hard 12 slab climbing?
Well, the most important thing, and I think, when I hear people talk about or write about slab climbing, the thing they don't get is the most important thing is to put weight on your fingers. It's not as much about the feet. Obviously, you have to have precision with your footwork, but to climb the really hard slabs, you really have to take weight off your feet by putting it onto your fingers. So it's all about crimping technique and getting as much weight as you can on your fingertip pads.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What is the difference between a super hard slab climb and a face climb, or like a vertical climb? Like, is it just the angle, or it's just off enough where it becomes a slab climb?
Nowadays, people call everything a slab if it's not overhanging. So, you see it's like a vertical cliff. They go, it's a slab. And I'm like, really? That's a slab?
Yeah.
So, in recent years, I've heard slab used up to vertical. But in the old days, a slab meant something that's less than vertical. I don't know what the point of slab to face is, but Now I think the nomenclature is that anything vertical or less than vertical is being called a slab.
Mm. Do you
Yeah.
find in the harder slab climbs where you sometimes do like opposing holds where you kind of like are pressing kind of with your thumbs almost to isolate your upper body as you move your feet?
Sometimes, it all depends. Most of the time you're pulling down. Sometimes you're using side pulls. But yeah, sometimes mantling. If you use a thumb press as opposed to your palm, you get an extra inch or two of reach.
Yeah.
You know.
Interesting. That's awesome. Yeah, my first slab climb, I would say real slab climb, was Serpentine on Suicide. Like that 5.9 that goes, the 3-pitch 5.9. Absolutely opened my mind to what climbing was. And I honestly like really fell in love with the sport and the movement. I feel like slab climbing forces such beautiful movement, and I love how calm it is. It's like you're not trying really hard. It's just you have to be so precise and so delicate and so careful. It's like this whole different kind of experience than just like pulling on overhanging jugs. To me, it's like such a more beautiful dance and a beautiful experience.
Yeah, to give you an idea of kind of the peak of my slab prowess, sounds like you're familiar with the Weeping Wall, but back in the 90s, at one point, I was pretty dialed in on slab. I free soloed 10 karat gold and I down climbed the Serpentine.
No way. You down climbed that? Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Down climbing slab like that is another level.
But I felt solid. I mean, I was at a different level back then.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was really dialed into slab climbing.
Wow. Now, is that like, you're like kind of reverse pistol squatting and then like reaching down with your foot and then slowly adding weight to it and then shifting weight to the other foot?
Yeah, I mean, the key is in the fingers.
In the fingers.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. It's so interesting. You'd think the opposite. It's like slab climbing. It's all about the feet. It's so interesting that it's the opposite. I guess it makes sense.
Yeah, when you get to harder slab climbing, like 10 plus and above, it really boils down to finger strength. And that's one thing I always had is really good finger strength.
Interesting. Have you been like fingerboarding, or is it just the sheer amount of volume of climbing that you've done?
I used to do, like I said, a lot of training,
Yeah.
fingerboards, but a lot of it's just climbing. Yeah. Like when I was training for Silver Spur, I'd go out and I'd just look for slab boulder problems that were like V3 or harder. And I'd do those to train my fingertips just so I had some callus. Because like I said, every move for the first 7 bolts on that is V3 or harder. So I got my fingertips up to speed before I went up there.
Nice. What about Saddle Rock? This is kind of the last one at least I have written down in terms of first ascents.
Well, Silver Spurs on Saddle Rock.
Oh, okay. So it's the location. Got it.
I did another one up there called Where Have All the Cowboys Gone? And that's actually the more popular one. And that's a 2-pitch route on the left side that gets 4 stars. It's considered to be a pretty classic one.
Nice. Do you have any other kind of a notable first ascents that we haven't talked about so far that you've been proud of or that stick out in your mind?
Up in Idlewild, I think I'm most proud of 2 routes on Talkeets that I did. One is the first free ascent of the Stairway to Heaven that I did with John Long in 1984. And that's a 512 3-pitch climb, actually 4 pitches to the top.
Tell me about that.
And then I did a really hard face climb to the left of the open book that's called the Bookworm. And I actually named it after my wife because she's such a voracious reader. And it's one that I worked on. I probably worked on it 5 days as a project, and it's a 512 plus, but the rock on that is so good. And the crux was really kind of bizarre and really hard. And I actually built a mock-up of the crux in my garage. So I measured the angle and the holds and everything. And I built a little model of it at my garage. And I did it like 1,000 times in my garage. And then when I finally went up there, it was a piece of cake.
Wow. So cool. So cool. That's so Tommy Codwell took the beta from you for his Donwall project. That's awesome. Okay. So I think, we've talked a lot about first ascents. We've talked about bolting. We talked a little bit about retrobolting. I want to
retrobolting.
Retrobolting. I want to talk about. I want to call them the bolting wars. It's a bit dramatic and kind of catchy, but I more about the process of bolting over your time as in in your climbing career. I think the big transition, at least from my understanding, is the ethics from ground up to wrap bolting. That seemed like a big shift, and almost kind of increased the access and the number of bolts that were going up that maybe caused all of these access issues that we're running into. So talk to us about this bolting progression and how you've seen it develop, and kind of bring us to where we're at today.
Well, that's a big one there. So when I started out, it was 1/4-inch bolts as the norm. And we thought, wow, it's a bolt. It's solid, And, a brand new 1/4-inch bolt is rated at about 2,000 pounds shear strength, which is similar to like a regular size wired stopper. The problem is over time they age. And, not every bolt is the same length and in the same quality rock. So that was the standard. Back in the old days when we were doing new routes, it was pretty easy to drill a 1/4-inch bolt because they're so tiny. So it was easier to do it ground up because it was quicker and easier to drill the hole. So you could do it from stances. And, like I said, if you install a brand new bolt, we considered it a bomber. But then as time progressed, those bolts started to age. And as climbing got more popular, climbers demanded safer anchors. So the standard became 3/8-inch bolts. And those are very difficult to drill by hand. So in the beginning, in the ground up era, most of the bolts were drilled on the lead with a hand drill. So you either had to stop and find a place where you had a stance, and then get the drill with the drill holder out, and then get your hammer and just start pounding away at it. I got really good at it. Some of the best ground up drillers I've seen were Charles Cole, the guy who founded the 510 company. I was really good. John Long could do it really fast. He didn't do that many, but he was really fast. But it was, I think it's kind of a lost art form. And I think I brought it up a notch, maybe to its zenith back in probably the 90s in Yosemite and Idlewild, where I would go up on the lead with nothing except my drill and my holder and the hammer. So I'd go up there on the run out, and I'd get a stance, and maybe I'd get a hook, and then I'd drill a little hole, and then I'd pound a bat hook in there. Then I'd pull up all the equipment and drill a big ass bolt. So I developed some sort of advanced ground up techniques. But after a while, it got kind of silly where, like at Joshua Tree, you have a 40-foot sport climb. And to use those tactics on the lead, it just seemed kind of silly. And American climbers started going over to Europe, and they saw what was going on in France. So sport climbing really wasn't a thing until, I didn't even hear the term sport climbing until about 1985. And Bachar went over there and came back. He was climbing at the highest standards over there. A guy named Christian Griffith went over there, and he came back to El Dorado Canyon and started wrap bolting, and immediately his bolt got chopped. And kind of at the same time, there was a guy named Alan Watts who was developing Smith Rock up in Oregon, kind of isolated in a bubble, and no one was really paying attention to what he was doing, but he just was wrap bolting everything. And he developed that whole area like that, kind of in isolation, whereas in Southern California at Joshua Tree and Idlewild, Talkeets and Suicide Rocks and Idlewild, and Yosemite, there was a real traditional ethic where everything was done ground up. But then when these sport climbing, European ethics started to creep in, that created the conflict. And I can remember at one time in the 90s, both John Bachar and Scott Cosgrove were working for me as guides, and they showed up the same day at the parking lot to meet their clients, and I was there, and Bachar had just chopped some of Scott's bolts. And I thought they were going to have a fist fight or something, but there were actual fist fights. Bachar got punched in Yosemite over over rat bolting, and actually he chopped someone's bolts, and the rat bolter punched him. But yeah, it was a weird time, and it lasted at Joshua Tree longer than any other area. The ethics were so severe in Joshua Tree, it was crazy. I remember one time Bachar actually chopped a bolt, not because someone rat bolted it, but because they top roped the root first before they drilled the bolt on the lead.
Wow.
The ethics were that stringent.
Wow.
So, but I think the big shift was in what the general climbing public required as far as safety and anchors, and the 1/4-inch bolts were not considered safe anymore. They wanted 3/8-inch bolts, and that was really the impetus, because it's really hard to drill this by hand. And now everybody wants 1/2-inch bolts. So, it went from 1/4-inch bolts, those were replaced by 3/8-inch bolts, and now all the 3/8-inch bolts are getting replaced by 1/2-inch bolts. So now the standard, like a Joshua Tree, is a 1/2-inch bolt.
Mm. What do you feel? So I would say like the European tactic is there out of efficiency, right? It's just like, let's put up more routes. Let's do this, I would say, in a way that facilitates a better experience. What do you think about the ethics that were so ingrained into these areas? And why were people holding on to them so much? Like, what were the benefits and why were the reasons, other than just like, this is how it's done, other than resisting to change? What were the reasons why people were holding on to these ethics?
That's a difficult question. I think, to go back to what you said about Europeans, I think in Europe it was the nature of the rock, and it's limestone, so you don't have a lot of cracks. And if you're going to lead that stuff, you need bolts. And I think at Joshua Tree and Yosemite, yeah, it was a small group of climbers, and there was a lot of peer pressure, not only in the ground up ethic, but not over bolting and just placing enough bolts. So I think the way I would describe it is, back then when I started climbing at Joshua Tree, what was considered to be most sought after was boldness in climbing, not safety. And so that's something that everyone was kind of going after, was if they were putting up new routes, they were putting up really badass, bold new routes. And they weren't looking at it like, oh, this route's going to be here forever and future generations are going to be climbing this thing. They looked at it like, well, my friends are going to think I'm pretty badass because I only put in 2 bolts instead of 5. So it was more like that. So, yeah, it just didn't make, after a while, certain really famous trad climbers kind of broke ranks, like Ron Kauk in Yosemite, started rat bolting. And there was just, it slowly crept in. And I remember there was this famous climber in Yosemite, Eric Zishi, and I was talking to him in the Yosemite Valley, and he said, there's this big, he was like a Southern guy, and he's like, there's this big tidal wave coming, and it's just coming, and it's breaking right over Bachar, and it's just gonna like drown him, and it's all over. There's a wave coming.
Yeah.
And he was right.
Wow. And here we are.
Here we are.
Here we are.
So now it's just a matter of, can we place bolts at all? So it's come full circle. And like you said, those bolt wars, those don't help the land managers as far as access issues go, because they're like, wow, these climbers, they can't even agree amongst themselves. They're battling it out. They're chopping bolts. So that didn't help. But yeah, so now it's a matter of, can we bolt at all? And that's the big issue in recent years.
So your story about Smith Rock, is that a separate story from the area that got shut down?
That's where Alan Watson. But yeah, there have been areas like that where, people sort of poached in there and bolted when they weren't even supposed to be climbing there. And, that creates access issues for sure. And now the big issue is wilderness. So there's a big distinction between being able to put bolts in non-wilderness and congressionally designated wilderness areas. And a lot of people don't know it, but everything above the 4,000-foot contour in Yosemite Valley is wilderness. That includes all the big formations: El Capitan, Half Dome, Sentinel Rock, Cathedral Rocks, Washington Column, all that stuff.
So where do we stand now as a culture? And I think I was told that we came very close to losing climbing altogether in Joshua Tree. Is that true?
Not climbing, but bolting. So, I don't think climbing was in jeopardy, but our ability to place bolts and replace aging bolts in wilderness was in jeopardy. And that wasn't just Joshua Tree, it was nationwide, and it dealt specifically with wilderness areas. So what happened was, in the Biden administration, there were some lawyers and some people in both the National Park Service and the Forest Service who got together and came up with a new interpretation of the Wilderness Act, which says you can't have man-made installations in wilderness areas. And what they determined, or tried to determine, was that bolts are installations. They're man-made installations, and therefore all bolts are illegal in congressionally designated wilderness. Like Joshua Tree has wilderness areas. Most great climbing areas in the country are in wilderness. So there are a lot of them. And it was a big deal. So the Access Fund got involved, and this is one of the biggest wins for them. There were two laws that were passed. One was the Protect American Climbing Act, and the Explore Act. And those went through Congress and got passed. And basically what they're saying in those laws is that bolts are allowed in wilderness, but there can be some restrictions. So there's the catch. And at Joshua Tree, what they were trying to do was designate the type of route and whether or not that route would be allowed to exist in wilderness. For example, trad climbs, they were calling it trad face, that had, a few bolts, those were fine. And even if you had a route with a bunch of bolts, even if you had a route with a bunch of protection placements and one bolt or two, they would still call that trad. If you had a route that's all bolts and one gear placement, they would call that trad too. So all it had to have in their definition was like one or two trad placements, and it's fine. But if it was all bolts for protection and for an anchor, it was considered a sport climb, and that was not going to be allowed in the wilderness areas. So that's a tough one, because there are a lot of great sport climbs in Joshua Tree Wilderness. So that was the crux of the issue, was they were saying that sport climbs didn't meet what's called the minimum requirement analysis to be allowed to exist in a wilderness area. And it's a bureaucratic process, but a minimum requirement analysis takes a look at whether that act is going to be allowed because it allows for safe recreation. And what they're saying is, they had Director's Order number 41, which came out, that says bolts are integral to rock climbing. They should be allowed, but you shouldn't have, quote unquote, bolt intensive routes. So when I first read that one, and that came out years ago, I was like, oh, you can't have bolt intensive routes. That's going to be a problem, because those are sport climbs. And I had a long discussion with Randy Levitt about it. And, he has all these great sport climbs from the 1980s in Joshua Tree that are like an hour into the wilderness. And by definition, Joshua Tree was saying, well, we're either going to remove the bolts or we're just not going to allow replacement of the bolts. And that's the crux, because what they're saying is, we don't think sport climbs should be allowed in wilderness. You can have trad face climbs, but you can't have sport climbs. So that's really the crux of the matter. But now with the Trump administration, the Forest Service and the Park Service, after that legislation came out, they just backed down and haven't heard a peep from them. So they kind of went silent. So now they don't have they're losing funding. The parks are losing manpower. So the last thing I think on their list right now is studying bolts and categorizing routes and whether or not the bolt should be able to exist. But it's kind of a bad in a way that now they don't even seem like they want to manage it. So to get permits to do new routes is becoming very difficult, if not impossible. Whereas before in Joshua Tree, they had a system for new routes and for bolt replacement. All you needed to do was get a permit. So now that process has slowed way down. And so it's kind of becoming an issue.
Where do we stand now with the legality of bolting? Is there due process for bolting in wilderness areas as it stands currently?
In Joshua Tree, and I just heard this last week, they're not allowing, they're not even accepting permits for new routes.
To
they
me,
said they don't have the staffing.
To me, that just means everyone's pirate bolting at this point.
Yeah, it's almost an invitation to pirate bolt because, you know, if you say, well, we're not going to give you a permit to replace those aging bolts on this 1980s classic sport climb, people are just going to do it.
Yeah.
So it's really a shame because I don't like to break the rules.
Yeah.
And I always played by the rules. And, you know, I'm a commercial permit holder in Joshua Tree when I ran my school for years and years. So I always played by the rules. And 2 years ago, it was great. You could get a permit for a new route in non-wilderness. You could get a permit to replace bolts. And now they're just on this big slowdown. And they just told me, oh, we're not accepting applications for new routes. And I'm like, oh, really? They say it's because of staffing cuts.
Yeah.
So you could blame that on the Trump administration, I guess.
Okay. I see an issue where, you know, pendulum swings, right? Right now we're in a situation where these Forest Service and these agencies don't have any funding. But let's say, you know, after Trump is gone and maybe the legislation or the administration changes and now all of a sudden these organizations have funding and now they have, you know, a lot of time on their hands and they're like, well, let's pick up this bolting issue again. What has happened in the last 6 years? And they see a wild amount of development in these wilderness areas. Do you see that as an issue that we are maybe missing, not looking far forward enough into the future?
Yeah, it's a big problem because they can use that against climbers and say, well, look at all this illegal activity that's going on. And there are huge lobbies, that lobby against bolts in wilderness.
Why? Okay, so why the focus on bolts? I understand that they've been labeled as like, what was the word you phrased? Like manufactured installments?
Man-made installations.
Man-made installations. Why such a focus on the bolts? Why do people care? Like, I couldn't even come up with an argument to say on how it's detrimental to the wilderness. Like, you can't even see them. Like, why are people so focused on trying to prevent these things from being put up?
That's a good argument, Kyle, and I've argued that before, it's more the philosophy that they argue rather than the reality. Because
what's the philosophy?
It's easy to argue, well, here's our interpretation there before a judge, and this is our interpretation of the wilderness. It says right here, no man-made installations are allowed in wilderness. No sign of man and all this. And they can just read it right off the Wilderness Act. And the judge will say, well, what's a bolt? And they'll say, well, a climber goes out there with his drill and he drills this big hole in the rock and he pounds in this metal thing and it's there forever. So that's sort of the definition of a man-made installation. It's an easy argument. The reality is, if you take that judge out there into some wilderness area, and particularly in the mountains, you know, you'll be on some trail and you can say, well, see that rock up there? It's 1,000 feet up there. Can you see any bolts up there? And he's going to go, well, unless they're glinting in the sun or something, you're not going to see anything. On the other hand, there are some cases, in some egregious cases, where there's a trail and you walk by and there's some 50-foot rock that's just grid bolted. So that's where we need to be careful, because there are some examples of that where climbers have gotten out of control. And so visually, I think you have to be very careful in developing crags that are near hiking trails where people can really see them. But yeah, I mean, that argument, it doesn't really work when you walk up to a rock that has a lot of sport climbs side by side because you can see the bolts.
Yeah, I could see that for sure. You don't want to, like, you're giving fuel to the fire of people who don't understand climbing. It's just like, we're climbers, we're climbing. We don't, you don't understand it, but like way up in the canyons, like the only person who's going to see that bolt is another climber.
But
And
yeah, the issue has kind of been hashed out in the courts and legislation. The Access Fund played a huge role, and getting those those laws through Congress, that was huge. And basically, it says that bolts are allowed in wilderness, but there has to be some management of it, and it's sort of back to square one where the Park Service is still going, well, yeah, we're not going to allow sport climbs. We'll allow bolts. And that's okay. So the era of just, you know, freelance bolting in wilderness is kind of over, I'm afraid to say. I mean, I got in to First Ascent at kind of a great period in American rock climbing where, you know, there were a lot of unclimbed routes and not a lot of regulation on bolting, and I could kind of do what I wanted. And now it's, you know, permits and regulations, and you can't do it, and you can do it in non-wilderness, but you can't do it in wilderness. So the era of bolted first ascents, I hate to say it, but it's really over in a major way in American rock climbing. And I kind of hate to say that, but I think the big issue now is our ability to maintain what we have and replace aging anchors. And that issue we've pretty much won. So, and that's the key going forward, is to preserve what we have, because El Capitan is in wilderness, you know, and we want to preserve the great climbing areas we have. I think there should be permit systems for new routes, but at Joshua Tree, I was really disheartened because I was putting up new routes last year with a permit. So now, you know, they blame it on staffing issues. I think that's kind of a lame excuse, but it's kind of what's happening with national parks. They're getting less funding, so they're not worried as much about bolts. They just tend to go like, okay, we're not going to do anything. No new bolts. We're not going to manage it. We're just going to say no bolts.
let's talk scorched earth here for a second. What do you see the real life implications of not following these rules in the long term? 10, 5, 6 years from now, pirate bolting continues, administration changes, national parks have funding again. What does that look like?
Well, I think one of the reasons why they banned bolts in Joshua Tree Wilderness back in 1993 was because they were lobbied by the Wilderness Society and these big lobbying groups. And I think they just wanted to satisfy them. So they said, okay, no new bolts in wilderness. And then, you know what? Here's what happened. People went in there and drilled thousands of bolts. And what did the Park Service do? Nothing. So it's kind of like saying, well, the speed limit's 55 miles an hour, but we're not going to write any tickets for somebody going 80 miles an hour. And so they kind of look the other way and just let it happen. But you're right, the pendulum is swung in the other direction. So now they're saying, okay, no new bolts. We'll just ban bolts. So are they going to go out and remove bolts? You know, I don't think they have the staffing or the manpower to do that now. Whether or not they do in the future remains to be seen. But I think there has to be some more lobbying that goes on, and a development of a climbing management program that has the ability for climbers to get permits to do new routes in wilderness. But at Joshua Tree, I could tell you right now, they're not going to allow sport climbs.
I totally understand the path forward on what we should be doing as a community and following the permit system. I guess just for I'm curious as to what enforcement would even look like. In order to enforce someone to not be bolting, or to go chop bolts that were there, you would have to be a climber to go and
they'll
do
get
that.
climbers. They can definitely get climbers that would do it.
Climbers are going to battle other climbers.
Absolutely. They could find people that there are a lot of climbers that don't want sport climbs in wilderness. It's not a unanimous group that says, oh yeah, we should be able to bolt
Yeah.
wherever we want. If you look at all the comments in the last go around with the comment periods to the Forest Service and the national parks, it was pretty split.
Wow.
Even among the climbing community. Not everybody's pro bolt. And particularly with the Instagram generation, I found it really odd. Like on the Access Fund's Instagram, I would say it's 90% of millennials or whatever age group was responding were completely anti-bolt.
Wow.
Completely anti-bolt. And these are the people that come out of the gyms and need to clip bolts and go sport climbing because they don't know how to trad climb.
Yeah. Yeah, I find it so interesting.
It was amazing the comments that the Access Fund got when they were lobbying for our rights to place bolts in wilderness. It was, like I said, it was 90%. We don't need bolts. Don't put bolts in the rock. You're scarring the rock. This is wilderness. We shouldn't have bolts. It was a lot of that.
It seems to me like people don't even know what they're talking about. They're just kind of like jumping on the bandwagon to be behind some sort of movement they don't understand.
It felt like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. I really struggle with the whole enforcement thought behind it all. Like, are we going to have climbing police that go arrest people? Like, are we going to start handing tickets out? Like, climbers are such a rebellious group of people. It's like built into our blood from the very beginning. It's like, it just seems like such a weird thing to harp on so dramatically. And I get the repercussions, and it's just such a sad place to be. It's hard. It's a hard place.
It's a difficult issue, but like I said, it's a bit sad to me, but I feel like the era of new routes in wilderness in American rock climbing is pretty much over. And I'm just happy that I was able to get into that era where I could actually go and do the routes I wanted to do. And it was a feeling of freedom, and I don't feel like I was excessive or anything like that, but it's different now for sure.
So your bolting days are over, as it were.
What? Right now in Joshua Tree, it's a pretty tight regulation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I'll still replace bolts. They still allow that. So there's a lot of work to be done there, going back and fixing aging anchors. So I'm going to, put some of my efforts into that. And that's always satisfying too.
We've talked a lot about the evolution of kind of bolting ethics, and a little bit about kind of the transition. We talked a little just recently, we mentioned gym climbers and that kind of new youth generation of climbers that are starting to kind of flood the scene. I would say we've created this funnel almost where, it's like gym to crag, right?
Yeah.
Watching this happen, watching gyms become so popular, watching internet come out, the Instagramification of climbing and how much information is out there. How have you seen these advancements and access change the sport over time?
Well, I think from what I've seen, most gym climbers, I'd say a pretty high percentage of them never go outside. The ones that do tend to gravitate to bouldering and sport climbing. And, the first gym in LA was 1995, the first real climbing wall. And I remember that because it was in Irvine where I lived, and it was a 48-foot tall entrepreneur panel wall that was slightly over. It was a beautiful wall. And I joined that gym and I thought, wow, this is great. But now I think the gym to crag thing, I think one of the things, that I focused on in my climbing school and guide training was, really teaching people leave no trace ethics, because a lot of the gym climbers, they don't have that foundation of being in the outdoors. Like I had when I was a kid. I was camping with my parents for weeks every summer for years, and I kind of learned how to deal with stuff in the outdoors. So that's something that, is important. They need some mentorship, like how to behave and how to take a poop and, just leave no trace and learn leave no trace ethics. So there's that. And then as guides, we always called it job security because people out of the gyms, they really needed to learn how to use that gear. And they were totally lacking in trad skills. So, for years and years and years, we taught people anchoring classes, leading classes. That was sort of our bread and butter. And then I think in more recent years, it's families coming out and wanting to climb. And, sure, they climb in the gym a lot, but when they go outdoors, they don't have that foundation of safety and using the equipment to set up trad climbs. So they'd rather just hire a guide and make it a fun and safe day for typically mom and dad and 2 kids. For the last 10 years of my climbing school, that was our bread and butter. Typical clients. They just want to have fun. They don't want to set it up themselves and take that risk. They want it to be safe. The guide's going to take them to a great spot. It's all going to be set up. It's all going to be safe. And they just want to have fun climbing. So the clientele, the demographic profile changed. When I first started guiding in the 80s, it was serious climbers that came out and hired a guide that wanted to climb hard stuff and be guided up hard climbs. And then, when the gyms came up, a lot of people wanted to learn trad. And then in recent years, the families, it's like maybe they climbed when they were younger, but then they had kids, they got out of it a little bit. Now they want to come back. And they'd rather just hire a guide and make it all safe and fun for them and not have to worry about it.
Why have you felt there's been a switch with the clientele who seek out guides? Why do we not seek guides for the full potential of what they have to offer us these days?
Well, I'm just saying that's the average, but there's still some people that want to come out and, hire a guide for guided climbing and do hard climbs. But the vast majority of the clientele, I would say, are just people that either want to take their families out or want to learn trad climbing skills and become self-sufficient.
No, I mean, I understand that. I guess it almost seems like there's been a change where, like we aren't seeking guides for reasons that we might should be, right? Like instead we see it as like, oh, guides are for families, guides are for Gumby climbers. Like I see so much potential for guides and how everybody in their climbing career can kind of get benefit from them. Do you feel like there's a kind of a misunderstanding?
Well, I'm just kind of telling you the norm, but yeah, I mean, for me in my climbing career, most of the clients that were my regular clients, they became like my climbing partners. And I still guide a lot part-time. And some of my clients I've guided for over 20 years. So essentially, that's kind of what you're talking about is they have the money. And when they go climbing, they want a solid partner who's going to be safe and is going to take them on good routes, knows the routes. They're going to have a fun day, and it's going to be more rewarding for them than if they went out and just started looking for partners on their own or climbed with their other climbing buddies who were maybe at the same standard. So for me as a guide with my private clientele, that's sort of what I've done for my entire climbing career is developed a clientele with people who climbed with me over and over again and enjoyed climbing with me. I enjoyed climbing with them. And we just went out climbing. And it was like a partnership.
Nice.
And that's what I enjoyed the most.
Yeah, I would imagine so, for sure. I just think that narrative needs to be shared more. I think that I would say in general, the public doesn't really understand that as a benefit of a guide. Like, I mean, obviously there's the financial barrier, but I think there's a lot to be learned there. And I think that most of us could benefit from at least one experience with a guide. And
they'll show up where most of the partners will flake out on you half the time, right? You're pretty much guaranteed the guide's going to show up.
Yeah. Oh, you've had quite an illustrious career. in the climbing space. And you have also kind of had this fun exploration of other areas. And one of them is in Hollywood. I'd love to dive into your experience of how you ended up into the film industry, and some of those key moments that you remember from that time.
Well, I think I'd use the word serendipitous again. And I kind of got lucky and just happened to be available at the right time. A friend of mine who was a climber by the name of Bob Carmichael was doing some climbing films in Boulder, and he started to get some work doing commercials in Hollywood, and he would hire his climbing friends to be the riggers for the climbing commercials. So I worked with him a lot, and back in the 90s, there were less sophisticated computer-generated images, so a lot of the stuff that was shot in commercials was actually the real deal shot on cliffs. So I worked a lot with him at the outset, and the way it works in Hollywood is if you're working with a production company and there's a certain crew, and you're working with a certain director, when they get work, they just tend to take the same crew with them from job to job. So it kind of snowballs, but that's really the way I started. Was I had a friend who was making climbing films, and then he started to work in Hollywood, and then he brought us along with him. And that was Bob Carmichael. So I owe him a lot. And he's the guy who I worked with on a movie called Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. And he got the gig to do the second unit. He was a second unit director on the scenes that were filmed in Yosemite Valley when Captain Kirk was going on a little free solo up on El Capitan in the opening of the movie.
Yeah, and Spock had to
Spock
save
had
him.
to save him.
Yeah. So this was early on in your climbing career, right? This is like early 80s?
Star Trek was filmed in 1988. And its theatrical release was in 1989.
Okay, so you've been climbing for 10 years or so.
Yeah.
Okay. So tell me about that scene where Kirk fell. You were part of the stunt. You were like a stunt double.
Yeah, I was the stunt double for Captain Kirk, and I think the reason why I got the job because I was the biggest, fattest climber they could find that could actually climb really hard. Because Shatner at that time, his heyday with Star Trek, the TV series was like 60s.
Okay.
So he was getting a little older. And so they go, hey, Bob, can you gain like 15 pounds? And I'm like, yeah, I could do that. And which made it harder to do those climbs, but still. And I remember they said, okay, we're going to have you meet with William Shatner at Paramount Studio, and he's just going to, talk to you and size you up and everything. So I remember it was a beautiful day in LA, and I'm driving through the gates, the Paramount lot, and I look up, I could see the Hollywood sign up on the hill there. And I thought, damn, I'm working in Hollywood. And then I met William Shatner, and I remember he got right in my face. He walked up to me, and we had a little chit chat. And he walked up to me, and he said, yeah, I heard you're a guide in Josh, and my tongue was like stuck to the roof of my mouth. I was so nervous because I was meeting like Captain Kirk. He was like my hero from childhood. So, but I guess I looked enough like him. I got the job, and he actually came up to Yosemite and did a little climbing at the base of El Cap on a route called Pine Line, which is like a 5.7. And then they built a mock-up of the boot flake, which is where he takes his fall from, the boot flake on the nose route, and a fiberglass mock-up of it, and erected it in the parking lot at the tunnel that is at the entrance to Yosemite Valley for him to do his little climbing. And then as a stunt double, I did a bunch of routes that were in a little montage. You don't have to watch the whole movie, but if you watch like the first 2 minutes, it's the opening scene of the movie. And at the time, like I said, it was before sophisticated computer generated images. So I remember Carmichael, the director, telling me, well, he's free soloing, so you're going to be climbing on belay on an 1/8-inch cable. And I'm like, huh? And I didn't really know that much about cables, but he said, Bob, Kenny Bates, who's the top stunt man in Hollywood as far as cable work goes, we're going to have you meet with him at Stony Point. He's going to show you everything about cables. So I met with him, and the guy knew nothing about climbing. And he's trying to convince me that, he's done all these falls on cables. And I'm like, if you had a dynamic rope that stretches, it's going to be a lot safer. But he showed me how to make the swedges and thimbles and loops on the cable and all the tools, and I learned everything about it. So when I got to Yosemite Valley, I thought, I better do some testing. And I got together with John Dill, who's the head of YOSAR, Yosemite Search and Rescue. And I told him, hey, I want to do these tests because they say I'm going to have to climb on this 1/8-inch cable. So 1/8-inch cable is rated at about 2,000 pounds. And I had a concrete block that weighed roughly the same as my body weight. And so we went out there and found an oak tree and, got an anchor up in the tree. And I think the first test, I raised the block about 5 feet. And then I looked at Dill, and he was smirking already. I could tell he knew what was going to happen. But the cable just snapped like kite string.
Oh,
just,
my God.
Like, didn't even slow it down. And I'm like, oh, no, holy shit. And so then I raised it up about maybe 2 feet, and it snapped again.
Oh, my God.
And I'm like, oh, no. But what I figured out was if I put some dynamic rope in the system, so I had the cable go into some rope, like I used 9mm dynamic rope, and as long as I had a length of dynamic rope in the system, the cable wouldn't snap. So I would drop, I think I dropped it 15 feet with the rope, and nothing did break. So then I was a little more confident to use the cable.
And so what was the actual stunt? How far did you fall? Because it looked like it was like a huge fall.
Yeah, I think it was a world record for a descender fall. So Ken Bates, who at the time was the top stuntman in Hollywood for descender cable falls. And it was kind of a weird technique, but basically what he did was he took the 1/8-inch cable and wound it around this giant spools like a big fishing reel, and essentially he would just get dropped. So as he was dropped, the cable would just peel out of off this giant spool, and there was like a hand disc brake that would slow him down at the end. So I looked at it, because I know a lot about dynamic versus static forces. And I looked at that and I'm like, holy shit, this is dangerous. And so they had it set up so that the spool, the descender rig, was anchored at the base of El Cap. So it ran all the way up about 400 foot up on the North American wall to an anchor and then back down to the ground. And then they hoisted him up and dropped him. And I remember when he was ready to clip in to get hoisted up, his hands were shaking so badly, I had to help him out. Like, hey, let me help you clip that in. And he was scared. I mean,
so it wasn't you. You didn't do the fall?
I didn't do the fall. His name was Ken Bates. And I was just the climbing double for Shatner. So all the climbing I did was belayed on a cable that went into a rope. And I devised that system so there was some elongation and some dynamic property in the system.
Yeah. Wow.
And I did separate reality, which was a big overhanging roof crack. And what was interesting about that one was, I don't know if you're familiar with separate reality, but it's this big overhanging hand crack that goes out this horizontal roof. It's a famous climb that was first done by Ron Kauk. And it's like a 512A. And it's interesting because it's really this thick wafer of rock at the top of the overhang, and the crack goes all the way through it. So if you're standing on top, you could look down through the crack. And so I'm climbing underneath, and the way I did that one was I had a little Swami belt on under my wardrobe, and then I had the rope tied into that, and I just ran it up the sleeve of the sweater. So I was cool as long as I didn't cross my hands over. I just shuffled my hands out the roof. And at the end of the roof, I had a little rung that was hidden that I could grab to kind of get over the lip. But I did that one, and I did the boot flake up on the nose route, which is, I think it's like 1,700 feet up there. I did the boot flake about 15 times.
Wow.
And en belay. It's pretty hard. It's like a 10C hand crack. And I remember when they shot that, they wanted to get a shot of him up there sort of all by himself because he's supposed to be free soloing. So they had their whole crew get out of there and wrap off. So I was the last one up there, and they did like this master shot where you see El Cap, and then they zoom in, zoom in, zoom in, and then you could see boot flake, and I'm climbing on it. So it was pretty cool because when it was wrapped, I got to rappel down about, I think it was almost 1,800 feet. And that was like the biggest rappel I've ever done. That was a lot of fun.
On a single strand?
I think it was a couple sections of rope, but just all in one go to rappel down from there was pretty cool.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. That's so cool. Such an interesting look into such a big industry, and also something that I would say climbing is like probably hadn't really touched very much in the way of actually like knowing what it is and how to film it. And I still feel like today, I mean, Jimmy Chin, I think, really did a great job at kind of bridging that gap. But I would say in general, the filming industry doesn't really understand like what it's like to actually film like real climbing.
Not at all. Yeah, there's that video of Alex Honnold commenting on, climbing in Hollywood films. And most of it, he's saying, oh, that's not a thing. You don't do that. Because it's usually guys just like dynoing, like they're free solo, and they're doing these dynos to like finger pockets. And I remember he was watching Stallone climb these icicles, like grabbing them with his bare hands. He's like, that's not a thing. And when he saw Star Trek, there was, the movement of my feet were really precise. And I actually free soloed the first pitch of Free Rider too. And when he saw it, he goes, that's Free Rider. And then when he saw the footwork, he goes, this is actually more like what free soloing is like. So I felt good about that when he saw me.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah, I wouldn't say that tactic is used very often anymore. Like actually having real climbers be stunt doubles. It's like so easy to fake it now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, you were a stunt double for Sylvester Stallone too, weren't you?
Actually, I was, and that was, we're talking about risk, and that's one of the times in the film business where I got involved in a risky situation.
What
And
happened?
it was at Red Rock in Nevada.
Oh, out here. I live in Vegas. It's right in my backyard.
Okay, yeah. And it was on a movie called Rambo 3. And John Long was actually the second unit director, which was pretty cool. So I was doubling for Stallone, where he's free soloing to get up to the enemy hideout in the movie. And we probably spent the whole second unit crew and a couple days out there. I think the budget was like $50,000, and it ended up being about 0.5 seconds in the movie. Total time. But anyways, there's this big limestone mesa-like cliff. If you're driving up the loop, it's on the right side. It's called the Turtle Head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Turtle Peak. And that's where I was doing the supposed free solo, was the top section of that, the top 100 feet. And it's actually limestone, and it's really good limestone. I think some people have done some new routes up there in recent years. But anyways, I was with Richard Harrison. He was the rigger, and he's a famous Red Rock climber. And we were flown up there with a helicopter. It was in the winter time, so it was pretty cold. There was a little snow up there. And it was a nice day. It wasn't windy. So, he belayed me. I kind of lowered down and climbed up a few times, and they did some helicopter shots. It was beautiful rock. It was like 510 climbing. And then the afternoon sort of wore on. The pilot had to go back and refuel. Started to get windy, and did some more filming. And then the winds really started to kick in. I think he had to go back and refuel, came back in, and we were just waiting to be picked up. And the for some reason, I think it was because of the wind, he couldn't land on top of the peak anymore. So we had to go down, scramble down to the saddle. And by then we were really cold. It was freezing. And I remember he had parked the helicopter in this little notch, like in a little col down below the summit. And I just jumped in the front. Richard jumped in the back. And I'm like, whew, let's go. And he looked at me, he turned to me and he said, winds are clocked about 45 knots. And I didn't even think anything. I'm like, okay, great, let's go. And when he took off, he just couldn't get any lift. So basically, the helicopter just dive bombed down the slope. And at one point, I think we actually went through a tree. The red warning light was going off and buzzing, and it was very close to crashing. And finally we landed, and I remember Richard Harrison said, fuck, if I would have known, I would have walked down. He was pissed. And I actually saw the same helicopter pilot a few years later on another movie, and he recognized me and he said, you know what? That's the closest I've ever come to crashing in a helicopter.
Wow. Yeah. Wow.
So
that's where luck comes in moments like that.
Yeah.
Just completely out of control.
Helicopters, I've worked on a lot of stunts and climbing shoots where helicopters are involved, and it's always fun to ride around in helicopters when the weather's nice, but helicopters are really dicey too in a way.
Yeah. So I've heard. I've had we had one guest on the show. He had fallen, the rock basically amputated his foot. It was hanging by a tendon. The helicopter comes, the lineman comes down and straps him together, straps him to the cord. And then all of a sudden the helicopter is just like falling out of the sky, like going down the cliffside, and he's tethered to it. And the SAR guy is like, fuck, like trying to unclip them from the tether. And apparently he didn't get it in time, and they're just getting drugged through the talus attached to this falling helicopter. And remarkably, somehow the helicopter was able to get lift again and pull up, and then boom, they get lifted up into the sky. Just wow. Like such a wild story.
Wow. The other big film I worked on, it was after Star Trek, was Cliffhanger. And that was in 1992. And the theatrical release was 1993, and that was the one with Sylvester Stallone.
What happened there? Was there anything specific with that?
Well, at first I was hired to train all the actors, and which was a lot of fun. For Stallone, we actually built a climbing wall in his backyard at his house in Bel Air, and I would go over there like once a week, and we'd train on his wall in his backyard. And so I spent a lot of time in his backyard. He let me in the house a few times, but it was a pretty cool wall. He had a tennis court, so it had a retaining wall all around it. And on that, we had all these bolted on holds with different routes that went up. And then we built a higher wall with 4x8 foot plywood panels with T-nuts and textured panels that went up 4 panels, so that's 32 feet, and slightly overhanging, so we had top ropes on that. And after the gig was over, I actually got those panels and put them in my garage, and that's where I built that mock-up that I was talking about on that climb bookworm on one of those panels.
Oh, okay, very cool, yeah.
But anyways, that was my initial job, and what was remarkable about Stallone was he had a huge ape index, like +7.
Wow.
And he climbed 510C on his first day.
Wow.
Super duper strong. I mean, he worked out with trainers all the time, so super fit. And at first I thought, wow, he's going to love climbing so much. He's going to be so good at it. He's going to want to go everywhere, because we had this big training program envisioned for him where he's going to come to Joshua Tree. He's going to go all over the place, do all this climbing. But I think he realized that, he was good enough to pull it off, because he had 2 of the best climbers at the time for his stunt doubles. He had Ron Kauk, who had just climbed Magic Line, which was like a 13D in Yosemite, the hardest trad climb, and Wolfgang Gulich, who had just done the first 514 in the world, as his doubles. And so he had those 2 guys. I remember there was a meeting where we were all sitting in his office, and Stallone said about Ron, because Ron was lean. Wolfgang was kind of buff, but Ron, he was lean and mean. He'd just done his hardest trad climb in Yosemite. And Stallone said, I think Ron's going to need a little supplementation. So, they were on, he brought him over there, and they were training and just eating like 5 meals a day and trying to bulk up to look like Stallone. But Wolfgang actually ended up doing most of the climbing doubling for Stallone when we went to Italy, and it was filmed in the Dolomites. But anyways, I remember when I was working with Stallone in the backyard, his associate producer, this Italian guy, came up to me and he said, Bob, we got to have a little talk. And I'm like, okay. And he said, Bob, nothing can happen to Sly. Do you understand me? Nothing could happen to Sly. And I'm like, well, maybe he shouldn't be climbing. He goes, no, Bob, listen to me. You got to listen to me. Nothing could happen to Sly. And I'm like, okay. So then we went over to Italy, and I was the chief safety officer. So I was in charge for the cast and crew on location, and we were in the Dolomites for about 4 months. And so that was a big responsibility, and it was a great job. The Dolomites are a beautiful range, and one thing I'll say about Stallone is he's no prima donna. And, it's not that he'll do his own stunts, but if you go, hey, would you jump off this little snow cliff and do a roll, tuck and roll? He's like, yeah, I'll do that.
Mm-hmm.
But if he got hurt, it would be a big deal, so there's no replacement for him. But yeah, I think Wolfgang did a really good job as his double. And, people thought it was going to be a climbing movie, but it turned out it really wasn't. I don't know if you've seen that movie. It was a lot more violent than I thought it was going to be. I mean, I liked the movie.
Which movie is this again?
Cliffhanger.
Cliffhanger, yeah. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, you should see that one. It's good. John Lithgow's in there. He's the villain.
Okay.
And, it was good times. Good times over there.
Were there any big safety concerns you had to mitigate?
Well, lightning was a big problem. And, I was always writing up all the safety reports. We only had one fatality. And that was the one of the caterers who was really stressed out because he had to get all that food up on the mountain every day. And he had an aneurysm, died in his room.
Oh, my God.
But the big risk on the peaks, I mean, we were in a real mountain range, and there was a big crew. Sometimes you had like a couple hundred people up on a mountain, and lightning was probably the biggest issue. One day there was a second unit crew up on top of this formation called Torre de Bise, which are these 2 towers that are divided, and they're about 600 feet and accessible only by helicopter. And a lightning cell moved in, and I think 5 people got hit by lightning one day.
Oh my gosh. In a single strike or separate events?
Separate strikes. Earl Wiggins, who's a famous
I've heard
climber from the desert areas around Moab and Canyonlands, he got knocked off the cliff. He got hit pretty hard, and it knocked him over the cliff. He flew like about 15 feet, and the cliff was like a 600-foot cliff, and luckily there was a little ledge just over the lip that he landed on, and he was okay. But that was a scary day. I wasn't up there, but I had to write a report about that.
Oh my gosh.
We had 2 helicopters flying, every day in the mountains for months. So right there, it's a dangerous situation. And I remember there was another close call with a helicopter. I wasn't in the helicopter, but I wrote a report about this one too. A new pilot came in, and to land on snow, you need snow skids. So he came in and he forgot to put his snow skids on. And when he landed, he was going to pick up some of the riggers. He was fine. The helicopter was sitting there, and then they all jumped in, and then all of a sudden the helicopter just went thump onto its belly and started sliding.
Oh.
And it was right on the edge of an 1,800-foot cliff. And a couple of the guys jumped out, which was a bad move because he got the tail rotor.
Yeah.
But nobody got hurt in that incident, but that was a wake-up call.
Whoa.
Um,
Did it stop sliding?
it stopped. Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah. That was a close call.
Wow. Such wild stories. It's so cool. Have you written, I mean, you've written a bunch of guidebooks. Have you ever written like a biography or an autobiography or putting these stories on paper?
Actually, I'm working on an autobiography of short stories,
Oh,
just
cool.
about, some of the cool guys I've climbed with. And some of the stuff just writes itself, like
Yeah.
some of the stories we're talking about. And I have done a lot of writing, and that's one of my next projects.
Very cool. That's exciting. What you've lived like I would say a very action-packed life. To someone trying to implement that into their lives, what advice would you have for them?
Well, I think my father gave me some advice when I was young. He says, because he knew that I was all in on climbing. He says, be careful making your hobby or your passion into a career. But it all worked out for me. I think it was just, like you said, serendipity is a word, and things happened. And I don't know if it was luck. It was more like the opportunities arose, and I was ready to take them on at the time. And part of it was just being prepared to do it, and the opportunity arose, and I could do it. Like working on a movie, you have to be kind of ready to go.
Did you make any sacrifices along the way?
It's tough on a relationship. I think that one movie, Cliffhanger, I was away for 4 months, and I was still running a climbing school, so my wife had to kind of take over, and that was a little strain on our relationship, but I thank her for doing that. But after that, I decided not to work on feature films, and in the film business focus on more short-term work, like commercials, which is usually like 2 days to maybe 2 weeks tops.
Mm-hmm. So pick your battles.
Pick your battles. That's what I say about climbing too.
Yeah, for sure. What about your experience with SEAL Team? SEAL Team 6, you had yet another very, I would say, unique opportunity to share your skills as a climber to a very small elite group of people that very few people have any contact with at all. Was this another serendipitous kind of position you found yourself in?
Yeah, I had a friend, Jay Smith, who's a top-notch climber, who had a contract with the SEALs, and he hired me to work with him. And I think the first contract we worked on was 1985. And over the years, I think I've worked with SEAL Team 6 from 85 up to, I think the last gig was probably 2010, right? I believe it was right before the Bin Laden raid. And in the beginning, SEAL Team 6 was more clandestine. They didn't call themselves Team 6. They were known as the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, and SEAL Team 6 didn't exist. It was only in recent years, like particularly after the Bin Laden raid, that, I think the SEALs themselves wanted more notoriety, and, books and movies have been written and produced about SEAL Team 6. So now it's more in the open, but back then it was a little more secretive. And yeah, I think I'm most proud. I've worked with a lot of military special forces and a lot of military groups over the years, but I think I'm most proud of my work with SEAL Team 6 because I think among the military, they are the most elite and the real cream of the crop. I mean, to get to that level of special forces, I think most people have no idea of the training and testing of physical and mental attributes that goes into that. I mean, just to become a SEAL is pretty tough. Like you have to go through the basic underwater demolition school, which is a 6-month program, and probably only 30% of the candidates make it through that. One of the SEALs told me an interesting story about buds, and during buds, there's a hell week where you have forced sleep deprivation. So they only allow you to sleep about 4 hours in a week. And so there's a lot of mental toughness training. And he said that one night they were out in the surf. So they were, out in the surf, just at various stages of hypothermia for most of the night. And then they called them all in, and they have like clean, warm beds for them. And they said, you guys go ahead and get some sleep. So they would just fall asleep. And about 15 minutes later, he said they woke everybody up and they said, okay, we're going to go back out in the surf. And he said about half of them quit right then and there. Yeah. So to get through buzz and to just get through to becoming a SEAL is very tough. And one of the problems is recruiting enough SEALs they could get through the training. I think they've actually lowered the standards in recent years. Like instead of doing it in real cold water, they do it in like warmer water. But they've had trouble, recruiting and enlisting enough SEALs just because it is so tough. The standards are so high. And after that, to get to SEAL Team 6, they only recruit the best of the best. And when you meet those guys, they're some of the most amazing humans that you'll ever meet because they're skilled physically and mentally, and they're just well-rounded in all aspects of, psychological and physical attributes.
Did that experience and these people that you found yourselves around have any sort of like effect on how you led your life?
Well, they do exude confidence. I don't know if I'm that confident as trained killers, but I think looking back at that, I think training someone at that high level, those guys at that high, it gave me a lot of confidence in my ability as a guide too, to know that they want me to work with them and they respect, my level of training that I could give them. So that gave me a lot of self-confidence in that I was chosen and they have a choice. And I look back at those years fondly, and I'm really proud of it too.
Very cool. Well, Bob, I think unless you feel like we've missed anything, this is the end of the road in terms of what I've got on the sheet. And is there anything else before we close it out?
Well, I'd just like to thank you, Kyle, for having me on the podcast. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I'm glad I got to share a few of my stories. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you, breaking the silence, as it were, because this is your first time speaking, kind of like in this public setting. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm always a little reticent to go on camera and go on interviews. I'm afraid I'm going to say something stupid, but I feel comfortable talking to you, and I appreciate your questions.
Yeah, awesome. No, I appreciate you doing the full kit and caboodle with the old TCM package and the mic and the camera and everything. I just think your story and your presence here just needs to be captured in the best light. So I appreciate you playing ball there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Again, ditto to you. I really appreciate your time. It's been such a great time chatting with you. Really cool to hear all these stories and just an absolute lifetime of experiences. And I think it's been an inspiration for me to just kind of live, take those opportunities and to live as fully as we can. I think it can be so easy to get kind of sucked into the grind, to the day to day, and there's a lot of life out there. So I appreciate the inspiration, and I hope everybody else is as inspired as I am right now.
Thanks, Kyle. Appreciate that.